Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today is day 6 of Bloomburrow spoilers, and I'm as excited as this duo is about this pie to talk about these new combos going on, new synergies coming to standard and older formats as well. So let's jump right into it. We got Doorport Mage, which is a 2-mana 1/3 frog wizard. It says whenever one or more creatures you control, one or more other creatures you control leave the battlefield without dying, draw a card. And you can pay 2 and tap to return another target creature you control to its owner's hand. So this card is doing a lot of what the frog strategies want to be doing in standard with, for example, the Sun Shower Druid comes into play abilities, being able to bounce this guy and then replay it and draw an extra card and get the life gain and put extra counters on things. Also with the Mistbreath Elder, which can bounce things without having to pay any mana, that's pretty good just to be able to draw an extra card every turn if you have the 2 of those out. So everything the kind of frog strategy is wanting to be doing, this guy really supports and can get you a lot of card advantage. It also kind of works with some of the cards in older formats. We've got Nurin the Weary in Modern, which would blink, kind of blinks itself basically every turn, and can also blink itself on your opponent's turn if they play a spell or attack. So you could get this draw card trigger each time that happens. So essentially, if you had the 2 of those out, you'd kind of like draw 2 extra cards every turn, which would be pretty powerful. Shrieking Drake can just return itself by paying 1 blue, so you could just draw extra cards for every blue mana you pay with the 2 of those. So definitely some powerful combos with this guy and the ability to draw a lot of cards with it. So we'll see. I mean, it's a bit fragile. Like 1/3 for 2 isn't great, but the abilities certainly have a pretty strong upside with some pretty good combos here. Next up, we've got the Portent of Calamity, which is a blue and an X sorcery. It says reveal the top X cards in your library. For each card type, you may exile a card of that type from among them. Put the rest into your graveyard. You may cast a spell from among the exiled cards without paying its mana cost. If you exiled 4 or more cards this way, then put the rest of the exiled cards into your hand. So this is kind of complicated. It sort of works as like almost like an X card draw spell, but you can only put one of each type into your hand, and then the rest go to your graveyard. So it can kind of fill up your graveyard. You could use it for like a graveyard strategy, or just a card draw strategy. The best mode, obviously, is being able to cast something that you revealed for free without paying its mana cost. Like Emrakul would be amazing. So I thought this card, I could see play, just in a control deck as a card draw spell. I think that's possible, but in maybe sort of an Urza land deck, a Tron deck, would be pretty good because they could generate a ton of mana to put into the X, and then usually Tron decks have like big top end creatures, or sometimes they have planeswalkers that are pretty expensive as well, different card types, and usually are running artifacts. So if you, for example, if you put 7 mana into this and top 7 cards, you had a land, a creature, an artifact, and a planeswalker, you could cast one of them for free. And if one of them was an Emrakul, that would be, pretty sweet way to cast an Emrakul, say on turn 4, if you were able to assemble Tron, or turn 3 if you had like a Talisman on 2, and then 3 you played the Tron and cast that. So I can see that potentially being a home for this card. It's kind of a complex card, and you have to kind of build your deck around it to have different types of cards and kind of hope to hit them each. But sort of on the baseline of it, it's just a card draw spell too. So it can have a really high upside, but the downside of it is pretty decent as well. So yeah, let me know if there's any other uses you think of this card. I wasn't quite sure exactly where it might find a home, but that's the one that I thought might be the most likely. Okay, next up we've got Elou the Shoreless Sea, which is a 4 mana, a lot of blue pips. Elemental legendary fish, which is stars. Power and toughness is equal to the number of islands you control. When it enters or attacks, put a flood counter on target land. It's an island in addition to other types as long as it has a flood counter on it. It says the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs blue, or 1 less to cast for each land you control with a flood counter on it. So a lot of stuff going on with this guy. Powerful effect to be able to reduce the costs of instants and sorceries you cast each turn. So it kind of like comes into play and gives you an extra mana basically, and then every time you attack, it kind of gives you another additional mana. And it is on each turn, so you could, for example, play this, put a flood counter on one of your lands, and cast a sorcery, 1 mana sorcery, and then on your opponent's turn cast, for example, Spell Pierce to try to protect it for free, and then the next turn attack with this, and then hold up. It would give you like counterspell mana for free, which would be pretty good. So I think it's, could be possible that the guy's really strong and kind of can snowball pretty well with counterspells and other blue instants and sorceries. There are some other cards that also put flood counters on lands that exist now, like the Quicksilver Fountain. So you could kind of have this and already have some flood counters on your lands to be able to use. Maybe that's a thing. I'm not sure. Obviously, kind of want to play this in a mono blue deck, but yeah, it's very interesting card, very unique abilities it has going on here. I mean, you could put it in like a Merfolk deck to turn your opponent's lands into islands. That could be something as well, but I think this is the last mode here. Reducing your instants and sorcery spells is like the most powerful thing this thing is doing. So, pretty cool card. Let me know what you guys think about this one as well. All right, next up we've got Coiling Rebirth, which is a, I got this little snake going around this tree, pretty cool. 5 mana for a sorcery, and it says gift a card, so you can have your opponent draw a card as you cast it to get the gift ability. Return target creature card from your graveyard. It says to play to the battlefield. This is sort of a translation that didn't have that say, but it does come back into play. Then if the gift was promised and that creature isn't legendary, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1. So, on the surface level, just being a 5 mana reanimate a creature is not great. I mean, it's kind of the standard rate, but typically you kind of get some sort of bonus as well as that. But being able to create a 1/1 copy of something as well can be quite powerful, especially with like Archon of Cruelty would be really good, because then you get 2 Archons of Cruelty. One would be a 1/1, sure, but you're mostly playing it for the come into play ability, so that could be very powerful. In standard, we got Trumpeting Carnosaur, which would be pretty nice with this, because you could, discard it, kill something on turn 3, turn 5, use this, gift a card, and then you'd get 2 Discover 5 triggers from the original one and from the 1/1. Maybe Vaultborn Tyrant, having 2 of those would be pretty decent, although it's not nearly as good the second one, because he doesn't have power for itself, so it wouldn't necessarily trigger again, and it's also a token, so if it dies, it wouldn't come back as a token. But you would be able to get another draw or gain 3 and draw a card off of it, and then if you played another creature with power 4 or greater, then that would also trigger the tokens ability again. So that could be decent. And then I thought it would be kind of funny with Tree of Perdition, because Agatha's Soul Cauldron is probably just a better combo, but this would be at least kind of funny, because you would get back the Tree of Perdition, then you get a 1/1 Tree of Perdition. You could tap that and put your opponent at 1 life. Yeah, so let me know if there's other kind of big creatures in standard or other formats you think would be a good target for this. Titan of Industry, I think, is rotating out. I was thinking about that one, but that's rotating out, so that's unfortunate. But yeah, Trumpeting Carnosaur seems like maybe perhaps the best target for this as well, because you could get the Carnosaur back and a copy of it back. You get 2 Discover 5s. You could discover into another one of these and then reanimate another thing from your graveyard and kind of go from there, potentially kind of just like combo off, essentially. So that could be kind of cool. But yeah, seems like definitely some pretty powerful potential with this Coiling Rebirth. Okay, next up we've got the KeenEyed Curator, which is a 2 mana Raccoon Scout, a 3/3. As long as there are 4 or more card types among cards exiled with it, it gets +4/+4 and trample, so 7/7 trampler. Pretty powerful for 2 mana. And then 1 to exile target card from a graveyard. So you could get this off as early as turn 3 in Modern with turn 1 Architects of Will. Cycle that, because it's a artifact and a creature, it would count as 2 types. Turn 2, play this guy. Turn 3, say you Tarfire or something, and then pay 2 mana to exile the Architects and the Tarfire. Tarfire is both a tribal and a goblin, or sorry, tribal and an instant. So that would be 4 types right there with just 2 cards, and then it would be a 7/7 trampler and attack. So it also kind of works with insidious roots in standard, which would be kind of cool because you can just pay 1 and maybe get a token here, a plant token, and then that would maybe you could just tap it for mana and then use that to exile more things from your graveyard, and that would kind of fuel itself. So I could definitely see it in an Insidious Fruits list as well. So yeah, definitely a cool card. Let me know if any other combos come to mind about this guy. But really, you just need more different types in your graveyard, and then exile them, and they become pretty huge. A good sideboard card potentially too, just as graveyard hate against an opponent's deck that is using graveyard reanimator deck or anything like that. So yeah, let's go to the next one, Scavenger's Talent, a 1 mana enchantment class, and it says whenever 1 or more creatures you control die, create a food token. This ability triggers only once each turn, sadly. 2 mana, level 2, whenever you sacrifice a permanent, target player mills 2 cards, and level 3, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice 3 other non-land permanents. If you do, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. So a lot of stuff going on with this card. The first ability is okay. If you have other creatures out that die, they kind of replace themselves with a food token, which you then can use to the second ability. If you sacrifice the food tokens you can sacrifice for 2 mana, and then mill your opponent or yourself if you wanted to do that. It also can be used for fodder in the third mode, the food token, to reanimate something. So this could just be, for example, like reanimate Atraxa. You're just trying to use it, 3 mana to reanimate something. It's pretty cheap. You do have to go through these other steps and have 3 other permanents you want to sacrifice. But being able to reanimate something every turn is definitely a powerful ability. And Atraxa would sort of get you enough fuel, most likely, to have more permanents to sacrifice again to kind of continue doing stuff with this. So yeah, it seems like a decent in a reanimator sort of strategy. But I was thinking about the second level, and I was thinking like, okay, maybe you can just use this as a way to like either mill yourself completely or mill out your opponent. If you had it, Pitiless Carnage is pretty cool because it lets you sacrifice any permanent. So you could literally sacrifice all your lands and all your whatevers to trigger this. If you had, 15 permanents in play, you could mill your opponent for 30. So maybe that's something. You also have it's decent with fetch lands because you sacrifice fetch lands, and standard we're having Fabled Passage. So maybe this would go in a mill deck just because it triggers off of fetch lands. Not sure. So definitely a lot of potential, a lot of stuff going on with this card. Let me know what you think, if there's any other good sort of synergies or combos with it. So I'll have to think about this one a little bit more, but those are kind of what came to mind at first glance. Okay, next up we've got Gev the Scaled Scorch, which is a 2 mana 3/2, a legendary creature, lizard mercenary, and it says ward, pay 2 life. So at least you're kind of getting some damage in with this guy. And it says other creatures you control enter with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each opponent who lost life this turn. So like if you're playing in Commander, this would be kind of cool if you just ping different opponents and then you would get additional +1/+1 counters. But in one-on-one standard and stuff, it's just 1 additional counter. And then whenever you cast a lizard spell, it deals 1 damage to a target opponent. So it works quite well with Hellspur Boss, and obviously we're getting a ton of more lizards in this set. But I thought it worked pretty well because when you play it, it triggers the last ability. So when it's on the stack, it'll ping the opponent, and then the Boss would come in with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and then all of the tokens that it makes also would come in with additional +1/+1 counters on it. It's also a mercenary, which is an outlaw. Excuse me. That's kind of the strategy that was not very good in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, but there wasn't a lot of support for it necessarily. So maybe that can sort of be a thing, giving all your outlaws. A lot of the lizards are kind of outlaws as well. So there's some synergy there. And then it's also sort of another Murderous Redcap infinite damage enabler. Essentially, if you have a sacrifice outlet, you can play the Murderous Redcap, do 2 to your opponent, and then so that'll turn on essentially this ability of getting +1/+1 counters, and then if you sacrifice it to something, it would come back, but the persist counter would get counteracted with the +1/+1 counter, and so then you could sacrifice and it would do damage to the opponent. Then you could sacrifice it again and just infinite damage essentially from there. So some cool synergy going on with that. Yeah, this guy seems pretty solid for a 2-drop, even in an aggressive deck or some combo potential. All right, next up we've got the Festival of Embers, which is a 5-mana enchantment. During your turn, you can cast instants and sorcery spells from your graveyard by paying 1 life in addition to the other costs. If a card or token will be put into your graveyard from anywhere, exile instead, and then you can sacrifice it for 2 mana if, for example, you don't want this sort of downside that everything is getting exiled when you put it into your graveyard. So I guess you could, like, if there was a bunch of instants, you could sort of cast those, put those on the stack, and then sacrifice this, and then they would go to the graveyard if you wanted to do that. Something like, I think that's why they put that last ability on it here. So it's kind of just Past in Flames. I think formats that have Past in Flames legal would probably never really want this card for those kind of decks. So yeah, I don't really know why this necessarily would be better than Past in Flames. But in formats that don't have Past in Flames, like Pioneer, Lotus Field maybe would want this. Maybe generates a ton of mana, and then it would be able to kind of double cast all your instants and sorceries again. You do have to pay an additional life to do it, so that is a downside for sure. I don't know in standard, like there's no rituals really in standard. I'm not sure exactly. I couldn't really think of any uses for this in standard. It's just like the clunky red enchantment that you get every every set that kind of does nothing. But yeah, maybe let me know in the comments if you think of any use. I mean, you could play it like a burn deck and then flashback all your burn stuff, but I don't really know. That doesn't seem that great. 5 mana to do nothing the turn it comes into play is not a great card. So yeah, that's all I had on Festival of Embers. Cool, very cool art though. I love that explosive tree going on there. All right, next up we've got the Fecund Green Shell, which is a 5 mana 4/6 elemental turtle for your turtle decks for sure. It's got reach. As long as you control 10 more lands, creatures you control get +2/+2. And whenever it or another creature you control with toughness greater than its power enters, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped. Otherwise, put it into your hand. So it kind of gets you a land, essentially draws you a card. If it's a land, it comes directly into play. A powerful effect, if you can get it off. Problem with this guy is he's 5 mana, which is kind of, if you're going to play something with 5 mana, it's got to be pretty impactful. He does have a lot of defense. He can block flyers, but he does get you a card when he comes into play. I just don't know if this guy does enough, to be honest. It does have some cool synergies. I was trying to think of how you could use this guy. I mean, in the Toughness Matters deck, or like Turtle Tribal deck, if you want, with the Bedrock Tortoise, things that care about having larger toughness would be definitely goes with that whole theme of that deck you could play. So yeah, he would attack for like 6 here, not bad, and then kind of trigger more guys who comes into play. Pretty sweet with Avenger of Zendikar. I'm not gonna lie, if you had this out and then you played Avenger of Zendikar, all the plant tokens would trigger its ability, and then if those hit lands, those would immediately come into play and trigger the landfall ability of this Avenger of Zendikar and create a huge board. That is a 5 mana and a 7 mana creature. But maybe some formats you could do that. Would be fun. You also have Awaken the Woods, which has some interesting synergy with this. If you play this and then you Awaken the Woods on the next turn, say for 4 forests, that would immediately give you 10 lands in play, and all of the 1/1s would be 3/3. So that's decent. It doesn't trigger the second ability, but it does certainly get you the +2/+2 for all your creatures. So maybe there's something there. I don't know. Let me know in the comments what you think about this guy. I think he's a bit mediocre, but certainly kind of a cool a cool guy for sure. All right, and then next up we got land the Fountain Port, which is a land that taps for colorless, and 2 to tap, sacrifice a token to draw a card. 3 to tap, pay 1 life, create a blue fish token, and 4 tap to create a treasure token. So a lot of abilities on this land. I think this is definitely going to see some play. Just it's got so much value just for a colorless land comes into play untapped. Um, you know, it's kind of similar to Mirex in that you can pay 3 to tap to create a 1/1. But this 1/1 can block. It doesn't give them poison counters, so that's definitely a difference. And this doesn't let you tap for colored mana the turn it comes into play like Mirex does, but it does have some other upside. So which is like the blue fish token can block, which is certainly relevant. Um, and being able to sacrifice a token to draw a card. It's also kind of a land that sort of taps for 2 mana in a ramp deck. What I mean by that is that you can kind of give yourself a burst of mana if you are on 5 lands and you tap this, or just 5 mana. You tap this, create a treasure token, then turn 6 you have access to 7 mana. You could play like a Traxa a turn earlier, for example, in a ramp deck. So I think this would certainly see play in a ramp deck like that. It turns on Chaotic Transformation, one of my pet cards, because it creates a creature token and also an artifact token. So you could use Chaotic Transformation, kind of curves into Chaotic Transformation to turn 4, you make a fish token, turn 5, a treasure token, turn 6, transformation them, and get your best creature and artifact into play at the same time. Yeah, maybe that's something, I don't know, hasn't really been a great strategy in the past, but can be fun. Give it a try. And you got the Omen Hawker. So Omen Hawker can tap to spend mana on activated abilities. There's like some other cards in standard. There's Enigma Jewel, I believe, that does a similar thing. So you could use that to activate its abilities, I guess, if you wanted to, power out treasure tokens. If you were playing like an Omen Hawker deck that had a bunch of activated abilities, you definitely play this land in there. And then it does create treasures, which is kind of unique. So for things like Magda or even the other Magda that really wants as many treasures as possible, you probably play a few of those in this deck. I mean, mostly the card is kind of incidental value. It's not like a huge thing, but it does a land that can provide incidental value is certainly something to look at. So Fountain Port seems like a pretty cool one. I would not be surprised if this sees play in a bunch of different decks. All right, and then last up we've got the Blooming Blast, which is an uncommon, 2 mana for an instant. You can gift a treasure, so you can give your opponent a treasure, and it does 2 damage to a creature. And if the gift was promised, it also does 3 damage to that creature's controller. So very similar to Searing Blaze in effect. Searing Blaze does 3 and 3 if you get landfall, but 1 and 1 if you don't. So maybe this would see play in burn strategies in modern potentially, or any other format. Burn strategies in standard potentially. It really depends on how much gifting a treasure would matter. In modern probably doesn't actually matter too much. At least in a burn strategy, you're just trying to get them dead as fast as possible. So I could certainly see potentially seeing play there. It's also kind of nice with Camball. All these gifting cards work really well with them. Giving your opponent a treasure would then give you a treasure, and then trigger the second ability to ping your opponent for 1 and gain a life. So we're certainly going to revisit that deck, I think for sure, in standard and with all the gifting cards. So that is the end of today's spoilers. Please let me know what you think about these cards. Any cool combos or decks that you're looking forward to building. Really appreciate you watching. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next episode.